Welcome to the research desk. Picture the physical landscape of European commerce in the dead of winter, somewhere in the early 1400s. A lone courier is riding a horse through an alpine pass, snow blinding his vision, navigating a treacherous route between Florence and Bruges.
And the crucial thing to visualize here is that in his saddlebags, he is not carrying gold. He is carrying paper, just fragile, ink-stained letters.
Right. We need to begin by stripping away the modern abstraction of finance. Today, we view capital as a frictionless entity. It is a digital pulse, moving billions of dollars from Tokyo to New York in milliseconds.
But in the 15th century, distance was an absolute physical tyrant. Wealth was overwhelmingly heavy.
Exactly. If you were attempting to settle a substantial transaction between London and Florence, you were dealing with physical mass, silver groats, gold florins, Venetian ducats. Transporting a fortune meant filling wooden strongboxes, hiring armed mercenaries, and literally dragging that weight across dozens of sovereign territories.
And every single one of those territories featured its own arbitrary tolls, its own shifting political allegiances, and, its own distinct, highly localized currency. The sheer physical friction of medieval trade is genuinely difficult for the modern mind to fully grasp.
In this era, a merchant's reputation did not live in a centralized algorithmic credit score. It lived entirely in those fragile paper letters carried by our courier on horseback. You could be considered a titan of finance in the piazzas of Florence, yet be functionally invisible, entirely without credit, the moment you stepped foot in Bruges.
Into this fragmented, opaque, and wildly dangerous environment steps the Medici family. History has overwhelmingly chosen to remember them through the lens of their cultural footprint. We are taught to view them as the grand patrons of the Renaissance, the intimate friends of popes.
But our debate today pivots on a very different premise. The central question we are debating is how the Medici actually achieved their unprecedented dominance. I will be taking the position that their true genius was architectural. They built a decentralized holding company bound by a unified data standard which allowed them to allocate capital better than any rival in Europe.
And I will be stress testing that premise. I will be arguing that the Medici story is the ultimate proof that an information system is just decoration if it lacks authority. The ledger worked flawlessly to warn them of toxic debt, but I argue that the later generations deliberately traded banking discipline for courtly prestige.
To truly appreciate the magnitude of the architecture they constructed, we really have to thoroughly diagnose the mechanical problem they were attempting to solve. Let us look closely at the mechanics of medieval commerce. Suppose you are operating a banking partnership with offices scattered across Rome, Florence, and Venice.
You have no telegraphs, you have no consolidated financial statements arriving magically at the end of the month.
Right, and you certainly have no modern auditors to dispatch on an airplane to verify warehouse inventory. So, how do you actually know what is happening on the ground?
You really do not. How do you know if a complex financial instrument executed in Bruges is genuinely a profitable currency service, or if it is secretly a disguised, highly risky, bad loan extended to a desperate local merchant?
The honest answer for the vast majority of banking families in this area was that they simply did not know. They operated almost entirely blind. They relied on deeply localized habit and personal trust. And, that is a terrible mechanism for scaling an enterprise.
We know exactly how dangerous that systemic blind spot was because we have the historical wreckage of the Bardi and Peruzzi banks to examine. Just one generation prior to the rise of the Medici, the Bardi and Peruzzi were massive, sprawling Florentine banking empires.
They were the absolute titans of their day, and they utterly collapsed in the 1340s. The mechanism of their destruction was uncontrolled exposure to sovereign borrowers, specifically King Edward III of England.
Right, they extended these massive loans to finance his military campaigns. When the king inevitably defaulted, the banks lacked the internal visibility, the structural isolation, and the risk parameters to contain the localized damage.
The failure in England cascaded through their entire network. The financial architecture imploded. taking a massive portion of the Florentine economy down with it. It is genuinely incredible to consider how these large institutions operated with almost no systemic risk controls. They were navigating a dark continent of finance with nothing but personal letters and raw hope.
The immense danger of that blind spot is clear, but we really have to connect that opacity to the specific economic realities that made solving the problem so incredibly lucrative. The institution that fundamentally altered the value of information in this era was the papacy.
Yes, the Catholic Church in the medieval and early Renaissance period was essentially the first truly multinational corporation. Church revenue was international by its very design.
Consider the map of Europe. You had fees, tithes, taxes, and payments for ecclesiastical appointments originating from bishoprics, abbeys, and monasteries, scattered from the deep, freezing forests of Germany to the distant fields of England.
All of that money was constantly, relentlessly flowing toward the Vatican in Rome. This was a wildly fragmented, chaotic revenue stream. The entity that could successfully standardize this map of obligations held the ultimate informational advantage.
The bank that could help the papal treasury receive, transfer, and disburse that vast wealth safely without having to physically haul chests of silver across bandit-infested mountain passes did not merely earn a transaction fee. They gained a God's eye view of the entire map of European money flows.
When Giovanni de' Medici moved his operations from Rome to Florence in 1397 to establish the bank, he understood this systemic dynamic perfectly. Other bankers could make localized loans. Other merchants could speculate in foreign exchange.
But the institution that could convert this continent of fragmented international papal obligations into a legible, standardized, managed system would dominate everything.
Managing that vast distance and complexity requires the invention of a new language. Before this period, merchants primarily kept narrative diary-style ledgers. If you open a pre-Medici accounting book, you are essentially reading a journal entry.
A merchant would simply write down a paragraph stating that on a specific Tuesday, he purchased a certain quantity of raw wool from a specific trader in the plaza and that he owed a certain amount of silver.
It was entirely qualitative, chronological, and hyper-localized. You could not easily extract a broad view of your assets and liabilities from these diaries.
The Medici transitioned to, and relentlessly enforced, the system of double-entry bookkeeping.
Now, we must be historically precise here. The Medici did not invent double-entry bookkeeping out of thin air. Other mathematically inclined Florentine and Venetian merchants had been experimenting with the method before them. But the Medici genius lay in weaponizing it as a management technology across vast distances. Suddenly, every single transaction had a matching debit and credit. This is a profound conceptual shift in human organization.
If a manager in Geneva records a profit, that profit must mathematically balance against a specific asset or a reduction in a liability.
Florence could suddenly see if a branch's profits were real, tangible capital, or if their funds were dangerously tied up in illiquid political favors. We have concrete, empirical proof of this architectural discipline.
Right, if you look at the 1427 Florentine tax records, and specifically the 1441 and 1451 secret ledgers managed by Giovanni Benci, he operated essentially as the Medici network's chief financial officer.
You see a highly refined, strictly disciplined accounting architecture. They were demanding regular, standardized balance sheets from every distant branch. This was not just accounting for the sake of tidy record-keeping. This was accounting actively deployed as an instrument of central control.
The mathematical elegance of the double-entry system is undeniable, but we must interrogate how easily that control can be subverted by the reality of human behavior. Software does not stop fraud.
A ledger is not magic.
Exactly. It requires a continuous control loop and the iron will of human enforcement to mean anything. Consider the story of the early Venice branch and its manager, Neri Tornaquinci. The central partnership agreement drafted in Florence expressly forbade Tornaquinci from extending credit to certain highly risky German clients.
Venice was the gateway to the Holy Roman Empire. And German merchants were buying spices and silk, but their credit was notoriously volatile. Tornaquinci ignored the central directive. He extended the credit anyway to chase local yields.
When those German clients inevitably defaulted, Tornaquinci found himself in a massive financial hole. How did he respond? Did the flawless double-entry system act as an invisible barrier that stopped him?
No, not at all. He actively manipulated the inputs. He borrowed money locally in Venice at extortionate, ruinous interest rates to cover the missing capital. And then he reported fictitious, smooth profits back to Florence to hide the structural damage.
He lied to the ledger. The lesson the Medici took from the Tornaquinci disaster perfectly mirrors the modern corporate landscape. They realized that you cannot simply install an enterprise resource planning system and assume the company is mathematically secure.
Decentralization requires immense trust, but trust must be constantly, aggressively measured and verified. The ledger was merely the tool of verification. It only actually functioned when the central partners in Florence actively dispatched auditors.
They had to uncover the mathematical discrepancies themselves and enforce severe consequences on the offending manager. The Tornaquinci incident highlights localized fraud perfectly.
It also demonstrates precisely why the Medici engineered a structural safeguard to mitigate that exact type of risk. The double-entry ledger was only the software of the organization. The bank required a robust hardware structure to match it.
And that hardware was the branch partnership model. This is an incredible, systemic organizational invention, which has been heavily documented by economic sociologists like Paget and McLean.
The Medici deliberately did not structure their bank as a single monolithic corporate entity, with salaried clerks managing distant outposts. That structure would have invited catastrophic moral hazard.
Right. A salaried clerk in London has no personal incentive to protect the central capital back in Florence. Instead, every single branch, whether in Venice, Geneva, Bruges, or London, was established as a legally distinct partnership.
The local managers were junior partners. They were required to invest a substantial amount of their own personal capital into the branch, and in return, they received a significant, lucrative share of the local profits. They had deep skin in the game.
More importantly, this specific legal structure isolated systemic risk. If the London manager made a disastrous series of decisions and the branch failed, the legal liability was ring-fenced to that specific partnership.
A financial fire in the London branch did not automatically spread across the continent and burn down the central headquarters in Florence. The Medici effectively built an internal capital market.
They could allocate funds to the highest-performing branches and starve the underperforming ones, all guided by the metrics returned through the standardized double-entry system. The parallel to modern franchise or localized subsidiary models is striking.
The center in Florence did not actually need to own every single asset, nor did they need to micromanage every single transaction occurring in the markets of Bruges or Geneva. What Florence owned were the data standards, the paramount client relationships, and the right to compare performance across the entire network.
But local intelligence, the deep, nuanced knowledge of which merchant in Bruges is reliable, which currency is about to devalue, and which sovereign is overextended, is entirely useless to the central headquarters unless local agents are heavily incentivized to reveal that intelligence rather than hoard it.
By forcing the branch managers to put their own capital on the line and share in the localized profits, the Medici aligned those incentives brilliantly.
However, the structural protection of the holding company only functions as long as the center maintains the ruthless authority to strike down a rogue partner. The moment the central executives in Florence begin treating a branch manager like an untouchable aristocrat or a political peer rather than an accountable subordinate partner, the structural isolation evaporates.
To understand how powerful that localized intelligence became, we have to look at the massive fuel source that powered the entire machine. We have established the software in the ledger and the hardware in the branch partnership model.
But the ultimate liquidity engine was Rome. I want to examine a specific data point from the historian Raymond de Roover. We are looking at the meticulous figures from the year 1427.
Keep in mind the scale of wealth at this time, where a highly skilled laborer might earn 30 or 40 florins in an entire year.
In 1427, the Rome branch of the Medici Bank held approximately 100,000 florins in deposits. and this was sourced almost entirely from the Papal Curia.
Now contrast that staggering sum with the capitalization of the entire Medici Bank network across Europe, which was only about 25,000 florins.
It is staggering. The papal deposits sitting in just one single branch were 4 times the size of the total partner capital of the entire institution.
Furthermore, Cosimo de' Medici reported zero capital in the Rome branch itself. Zero. The absolute most profitable, dominant node in the entire European network required almost no partner capital to operate.
Wait, zero capital? How did they legally structure that?
Because the trusts of the papacy functioned as pure, unadulterated liquidity. Rome was a rushing river of funds. Florence was the central control room that directed the flow. The other branches across Europe were simply highly calibrated sensors deployed to find the most profitable geographic locations to deploy that liquidity.
It is an absolute masterpiece of leverage. But, leverage always carries a profound systemic risk. But the mechanics of the engine are undeniable. When you map out the flow of this capital, you start to see a compounding flywheel that looks shockingly modern.
It absolutely mirrors the strategic, self-reinforcing loops designed by massive technology platforms today. We can track the 5 distinct gears of this Medici machine. Gear 1 is the papal account. Managing the church's money brings immense, unquantifiable prestige and a massive influx of zero-cost deposits.
Gear 2 is deployment. Those vast deposits are deployed to fund foreign exchange and trade across the continent. Because of strict medieval usury laws, a bank could not simply charge simple interest on a loan without risking excommunication.
Right. The profit had to be hidden. You had to embed the interest rate into complex, delayed currency exchange rates across different geographies, the bill of exchange.
Which leads to Gear 3. The distant branches in Geneva, Bruges, and London facilitate these complex exchanges. But more importantly, they act as intelligence-gathering nodes. They are relentlessly scooping up local intelligence on market conditions, the stability of local rulers, and impending currency fluctuations.
Then Gear 4. The standardized double-entry books take all that messy, localized intelligence and translate it into actionable, mathematically precise comparative data back in Florence.
And finally, Gear 5. The immense financial power generated by this superior capital allocation compounds into intense political power. This in turn reinforces the bank's brand, attracting even more deposits from the European elite and securing even more lucrative relationships.
This is not a passive data collection system. This is an aggressive, active information loop. Every piece of data feeds a system that alters pricing, logistical routes, and capital allocation in real time.
The central, defining characteristic of that flywheel is its active responsiveness. If a branch manager in Geneva is generating strong returns and maintaining pristine, highly liquid balance sheets, Florence feeds that branch more capital from the Rome liquidity pool.
And if a branch is weak, if the capital is turning over too slowly and becoming trapped in illiquid inventory, Florence dispatches auditors, reorganizes the partnership, or simply liquidates the branch entirely. The ledger makes the vast network intensely sensitive to reality.
By 1451, Cosimo de' Medici is overseeing an empire of investments, spanning Florence, Venice, Milan, Geneva, Avignon, Bruges, London, Pisa, alongside numerous industrial ventures in textiles and alum mining.
They are not merely running a large merchant shop. They are operating a highly distributed, highly sensitive financial nervous system. The competitive advantage they generated was completely insurmountable for any rival relying on intuition, localized trust, or narrative accounting.
The architecture was brilliant, but the advantage was not insurmountable because it was ultimately dismantled from within. The fundamental question we must ask about any compounding loop is this: what happens when the people reading the books stop caring about the math and start caring exclusively about the prestige of the brand?
What happens when the operators of the machine decide that the social status of the output is far more important than the integrity of the input? That is the exact wall the Medici hit.
It is not a rival banking family that brought them down. It was the slow, tragic internal conversion of an intensely disciplined information machine into a purely political machine. We can track that specific conversion generationally.
If you look at the founders, Giovanni Debits and his son Cosimo, they treated the bank fundamentally as an operating institution. They were bankers to the marrow of their bones. They read the balances meticulously. They understood the mechanics of the bill of exchange.
And most importantly, they harbored a deep, structural, almost paranoid fear of sovereign debt. They actively, aggressively avoided making loans to princes, dukes, and kings.
They knew from the traumatic Florentine history of the Bardi and Peruzzi that sovereigns were terrible clients because they possessed absolute legal immunity. If a wool merchant in Venice defaults on a loan, you take him to the local merchant court and seize his physical assets.
No recourse. A king answers to no court. But under the third generation, under Lorenzo the Magnificent, the entire operational philosophy of the institution shifted.
Lorenzo was an unquestionably brilliant diplomat, a magnificent patron of the arts, and a masterful political actor who balanced the volatile powers of the Italian peninsula. But he was not a banker.
He did not read the ledgers with the same ruthless scrutiny as his grandfather. Under his leadership, the bank ceased to be an end in itself. It became merely an instrument for funding and preserving the political dynasty.
We can observe the exact moment that philosophical shift destroyed the structural integrity of the bank. We must examine the catastrophic failure of the London branch. This is where the lack of central discipline becomes fatal.
The English wool trade was incredibly lucrative, representing some of the highest quality textiles in Europe. But during the brutal civil conflicts of the Wars of the Roses, access to that wool was entirely dictated by volatile political factions and royal export licenses.
The Medici branch manager in London, Gerardo Canigiani, begins making loan after loan directly to King Edward IV. The fundamental business model in London shifted away from analyzing mercantile credit risk and moved entirely toward buying political access.
Canigiani is extending massive credit just to secure the licenses required to export the wool. By 1468, the central auditor from Florence, Angelo Tani, arrives in London, opens the books, and discovers the horrifying reality.
Edward IV owes the bank approximately £8,500 sterling, with another £2,000 tied up in highly illiquid, useless royal pledges. Use simple, vivid language to describe this wasn't working capital.
It was entirely frozen, toxic political exposure. The loans could not possibly be called in. The king was effectively using the London branch of the Medici Bank as his own personal treasury to fight his civil wars.
And the branch manager allowed it to happen to maintain his social proximity to the crown. It is absolutely crucial to note what is happening structurally during the London failure and the subsequent disaster we see in Bruges. The accounting system did not fail.
The software worked exactly as it was designed to work. The double-entry books generated the audits. The balance sheets clearly and accurately exposed the massive sums of frozen capital.
The correspondence between Florence and the branches was filled with incredibly angry, detailed demands for explanation from the central auditors. The red flags were everywhere, waving furiously.
The mathematical system produced the exact signals required to save the institution. The tragic failure was entirely in governance. The executives in Florence saw the data, understood the risk, and failed to act.
The failure in governance reaches its absolute zenith, its most spectacular collapse, in the Bruges branch. I want to look closely at Tommaso Portinari, the manager in Bruges. Portinari represents the ultimate fatal courtier trap.
He was undeniably a talented banker, but he was completely consumed by ego, ambition, and a desperate desire for social elevation. He completely blurred the strict, necessary line between acting as a fiduciary for the Medici Bank and acting as a glittering courtier for Charles the Bold.
Charles the Bold was the enormously powerful Duke of Burgundy. The Burgundian court was the most lavish, opulent, and expensive in Europe, and Portinari wanted to be at the center of it, dispensing favors and wearing aristocratic titles.
In 1471, he leverages his political influence to negotiate a new partnership agreement with Florence. This new agreement explicitly allows him to make massive loans directly to the Burgundian court, up to an astonishing £6,000 groat.
That concession from Florence was an incredibly dangerous abandonment of the foundational rules set by Giovanni and Cosimo as Charles the Bold embarks on expensive, disastrous military campaigns against the Swiss, Portcinari keeps feeding him Medici capital.
To compound the disaster, the catastrophic, unrecoverable losses from the London branch are legally shifted onto the Bruges branch in a desperate accounting maneuver. The entire Northern European operation buckles under the immense weight of sovereign debts that far exceeded its earnings capacity.
Portcinari perfectly illustrates the complete breakdown of the branch partnership incentive structure. That specific legal structure was designed to protect the center by forcing the manager to risk his own capital.
But when a manager prioritizes social altitude, political vanity, and integration into a royal court over the mathematical return on capital, the financial incentives completely fail. The threat of losing his invested wealth was entirely outweighed in Portcinari's mind by the immense social prestige of sitting at the right hand of Charles the Bold, financing armies.
And Florence, under Lorenzo's leadership, allowed this catastrophic exposure to happen because Lorenzo himself was playing the exact same political game on the Italian peninsula. The ruthless, mathematical discipline that built the empire vanished.
This is the universal transferable lesson of the Medici collapse. The data was mathematically perfect. The reality of the risk was documented in precise double-entry detail. The central auditors knew exactly how badly the capital was frozen.
But the organizational discipline to act on that data, to ruthlessly liquidate the branch or fire the manager, had completely vanished.
I look at this historical arc and I immediately see the modern corporate landscape. Look at modern global banking. You regularly see major, supposedly sophisticated institutions making incredibly risky, low-yield prestige loans to connected sovereigns or to massive failing conglomerates, simply because the relationship carries political weight and executive vanity.
The algorithmic risk systems flag the immense exposure. The dashboards flash red, but the executive committee manually overrides the system for the sake of the relationship.
Or consider modern enterprise software companies. They possess incredibly sophisticated product analytics. They know exactly, down to the millisecond, what specific features drive actual user engagement and revenue.
Yet, they will routinely abandon their entire strategic product roadmap to chase the vanity of securing one massive, demanding enterprise client. They actively ignore their own data to secure the prestigious logo for their website.
A dashboard that is actively ignored is just an illuminated manuscript. It is a beautiful, expensive picture that tells a highly accurate story that absolutely nobody is listening to.
We must synthesize the two realities of this narrative. I maintain that the Medici constructed a flawless 15th century operating system for capital. They solved the fundamental, paralyzing problem of distance and opacity in medieval commerce.
They achieved this through a unified data standard, an aligned incentive architecture in the branch partnership model, and a dynamic, responsive control loop. They proved unequivocally that an informational edge systematically applied can build an empire.
However, I concede the ultimate verdict of their collapse. No financial architecture, no matter how rigorously engineered, mathematically elegant, or legally robust, can survive a leadership team that deliberately overrides its own risk parameters for the sake of social status and political preservation.
The machine they built was perfect. The human operators corrupted it.
That verdict allows us to distill the ultimate truth of this historical arc. The Medici brand famously outlived the Medici Bank. Their political and cultural power endured for centuries after the financial structure completely collapsed under the weight of sovereign debt.
But for builders, executives, analysts today, the structural lesson is remarkably clear. The very first real moat in capitalism is knowing your own machine better than anyone else knows theirs.
You absolutely need the three distinct layers of the edge: the rigorous data standard to see the reality of the market, the aligned incentive architecture to force your agents to gather the truth, and the dynamic control loop to act on the data.
But all three of those structural layers are entirely, completely useless without the iron will of governance.
We live in an era where every single company, from the smallest emerging startup to the largest, most entrenched multinational, aggressively claims to be entirely data-driven. Organizations spend millions of dollars deploying enterprise resource planning systems, real-time analytics, and highly sophisticated risk modeling.
But the lingering, uncomfortable question we have to ask is this. When a modern, mathematically precise risk report fundamentally clashes with a charismatic founder's personal ambition, or when the million-dollar dashboard clearly states the core business model is breaking under the immense weight of a vanity project, do today's organizations actually have the discipline to listen to their own machine?
This is the research desk officially signing off.